What does it look like when money disappears in broad daylight? Not in a back alley, but inside a federal hearing room, under oath with cameras rolling. What does it sound like when a man doesn't deny the accusation? He just runs out of answers. Because this was not a normal hearing. This was a controlled detonation. Thomas Massie didn't walk into that room to debate policy. He walked in with a red folder thick enough to end a career. And across from him sat Stephen Miller, prepared, rehearsed, confident, until the numbers hit the table. First $847,000, then $2.3 million. Now $4.1 million. And you're telling this committee you can't explain a single dollar? That wasn't rhetoric, that was evidence. Let's frame this clearly. This is not about immigration policy. This is not about political disagreement. This is about public money moving through the Department of Homeland Security into entities that, on paper, do not exist. March 15th. A wire transfer. $847,000. 3 weeks into Miller's tenure. Destination. A shell company with no employees, no address, no operational history. That's not an allegation, that's a record. And when asked directly, Stephen Miller didn't explain it. He said he wasn't aware. But here's where the story stops being about what Stephen Miller said and starts being about what the documents say. Because 3 days after that March 15th transfer, an internal DHS memo moved through the system. Date stamped. Circulated to division heads. Subject line. Operational protocol. And buried inside it, one phrase that matters more than anything else. Law enforcement sensitive. Not for an ongoing investigation, not for an active threat. For a payment. Now think about that for a second. If you wired nearly $1 million from a government account to a company with no employees and someone flagged it, your instinct would be to explain it, justify it, document it. That's how systems are supposed to work. But that's not what happened here. A Treasury analyst reviewed the transaction. Not a politician, not a rival. A career analyst. The kind of person who doesn't speculate, only flags what crosses a threshold. Quote, "No verifiable operational history meets criteria for suspicious activity." That triggers a report. Mandatory. Automated in most cases. And yet, in this case, the response came back in writing. Do not file. Override. Not delayed. Not reviewed. Stopped. Now here's the contradiction no one in that room could ignore. Stephen Miller sat there under oath claiming limited awareness of individual transactions. While the paper trail shows the authorization chain moved through his policy office, the classification was issued under his structure and the red flag was actively suppressed by executive direction. So which one is it? Because both cannot be true at the same time. Either Stephen Miller was not aware of these transactions, meaning a chain of classified financial decisions moved through his own policy structure without his knowledge, or he was aware and chose language carefully enough to avoid saying it out loud. And that distinction matters. Because on April 2nd, the pattern didn't stop. It repeated. Another transfer. $1.2 million. Different company name. Same structure. No employees. No address. No operational footprint. April 9th. Again, $1.05 million. Another entity. Another empty shell. April 15th. Smaller number this time. $293,000. Then again, the exact same figure as the first transfer, $847,000, reappears. Identical, not approximate. Identical. And then May 1st, $1.1 million. 6 payments, 6 separate entities. Total, $4.1 million. Now pause there, because this is where the logic locks in. If this were one transaction, you could argue error. If this were 2, you could argue coincidence. But 6, structured, timed, distributed across different shell entities? That's not noise, that's design. And while those payments were leaving the system, what was happening on the ground? DHS operational reports. Same time window, March through May. Apprehensions down 3%. Processing capacity unchanged. No new infrastructure, no new systems. No measurable expansion of capability. So let's translate that into plain language. $4.1 million left. Nothing measurable came back. No upgraded border systems. No increase in enforcement output. No traceable operational gain. Just money, moving. Now this is where the hearing shifted from uncomfortable to irreversible. Because Thomas Massie didn't just list the payments, he aligned them with the silence. He didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He asked one question. Did you authorize any of these 6 payments, yes or no? That's not a complex question. That's not classified. That's not policy. That's accountability in its simplest form. And in that moment, all the preparation, 42 pages of statements, rehearsed answers, legal positioning, collapsed into one decision. Answer or don't? Because if Stephen Miller says yes, he owns the decision chain. If he says no, he disconnects himself from his own office's authorization trail. If he explains, he exposes the mechanism. 3 options, all of them costly. And so he chose the 4th. He declined. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard. On the advice of counsel, I declined to answer. Now understand what just happened. That is not a denial. That is not an explanation. That is a boundary, a line between what can be said publicly and what cannot survive public scrutiny. And the room felt it. Because silence under oath is not neutral. It carries weight. It fills the gaps that words refuse to occupy. And when you stack that silence on top of 6 transactions, 6 shell companies, a suppressed suspicious activity report, and a classification memo that sealed financial movement as law enforcement sensitive, you don't just have unanswered questions. You have a structure, a system that moved money, classified the trail, and blocked the trigger that would have forced accountability. And that's the moment this stops being about one official, or one hearing, or one political fight. This becomes about whether the system itself still works. This becomes about whether the system itself still works. Because strip away the titles, strip away the politics, and what you are left with is something much simpler and much harder to ignore. Public money left a federal account. It moved through a controlled chain of authorization. It landed in entities that do not function like real companies. And when the system tried to flag it, the flag was turned off. That's not a loophole, that's a decision. Now place that against the people who fund that system. Taxpayers who don't get to decline to answer when their numbers don't add up. Small businesses audited over minor discrepancies. Individuals flagged, investigated, questioned, because the system demands transparency from them. But here, $4.1 million moves and the answer is silence. That's the moral fracture. Because this is not about Democrats or Republicans. This is about whether rules apply differently depending on where you sit. Whether accountability is a requirement or a performance. Thomas Massie didn't prove everything in that moment. He didn't need to. He showed enough to establish the pattern, enough to expose the contradiction, enough to force one question that still hasn't been answered. If nothing improper happened, why couldn't Stephen Miller say it, clearly, directly, under oath? So now it shifts to you. Do you believe this is just complexity or concealment? Because if a system can move millions without explanation, what else can it move? And if silence is allowed to stand in place of answers, what does accountability even mean anymore? If you think this matters, hit like, leave your perspective in the comments, share this with someone who still believes oversight works, and subscribe. Because the next question isn't what happened. It's who gets to avoid answering for it.